So now is question number 8, export of goods and services. Introduction. Exporting goods ensures global trade, crucial for economic growth and development, governed by Customs Act 1962. Foreign Exchange Management Act regulates, ensures compliance with international standards, facilitates trade between countries. Customs officers monitor export shipments, foreign currency and remittance involved. Exporters need proper documentation, duty exemptions for specific exports, goods must pass export inspection, export policies constantly evolving, compliance with trade agreements necessary, encourages foreign exchange inflow. Exporters must register with customs services also subject to export rules affects balance of trade positively. Export subject to regulatory control, protection of intellectual property rights, focus on transparency and fairness. Types of exports, goods and services. Goods export physical items shipped abroad. Services export non physical, intangible services offered. Free exports, no restrictions on export. Restricted exports subject to regulation restrictions. Prohibited exports, banned items or services. Special economic zone exports, tax exemptions for sales. Deemed exports, supplies treated as exports. Indirect exports, goods exported through intermediaries. Temporary exports, goods for specific duration. Government assisted exports, incentives provided for exports. Public sector exports, state owned enterprises involved. Private sector exports, exports by private enterprises. Export of services, IT, consulting, etc. Project exports, large scale infrastructure projects. Exports under duty drawback scheme, refund of duties for exports. Export of personal belongings, household items, and personal effects. Capital goods exports, machinery, equipment exported. Raw material export, primary materials for manufacturing. Finished goods export, processed or completed products. Export of intangible assets, intellectual property rights. Legal framework governing export. Customs Act 1962 governs export regulations. Foreign Trade Development and Regulation Act, Foreign Exchange Management Act, Export Import Policy regulates all exports. GST law applies to services export. SEZ Act provides export benefits. Anti dumping law apply to goods exported. Transfer pricing rules regulate international trade. Intellectual property laws protect exports. FEMA regulations govern foreign exchange. Trade agreements shape export policies. Bilateral, multilateral treaties encourage exports. WTO regulations affect global trade. Customs valuation rules determine export price. Foreign trade policy governs export. Shipping regulations ensure secure exports. Export license requirements defined by law. Customs duty exemption schemes for exports. Certificate of origin essential for exports. Export documentation compliance needed. Export documentation and compliance. Export invoice confirms goods for export. Packing list details goods packaging. Certificate of origin verifies product's origin. Bill of lading for goods shipment. Customs declaration form required for export. Export license issued for restricting goods. Letter of credit ensures payment. export declaration filed with customs, shipping bill registers export with customs, export contract governs terms and conditions, export invoice must match declaration, exporter must maintain detailed records, export credit guarantee available, inspection certificate verifies product quality, phytosanitary certificate for plant exports, health certificate required for livestock, exporter registration with DGFT mandatory, customs clearance required for goods export, bills of entry for customs clearance, explore, export declaration in prescribed form. Foreign exchange regulations, FEMA 1999, governs foreign exchange transactions. Exporters must comply with FEMA provisions. Export goods, services creates foreign exchange. Exporters may hold foreign currency. Foreign exchange must be repatriated promptly. Exporters need RBI's permission for transactions. Payment for foreign buyers must be repatriated. Exchange rates are controlled by RBI. Foreign remittances must follow regulations. Export proceeds must be reported. Foreign exchange earnings monitored by RBI. RBI authorizes banks for forex transactions. Non-compliance with FEMA incurs penalties. External commercial borrowings under FEMA export proceeds may be deferred. Non-resident Indians can invest via exports. RBI issues guidelines for exporters. Export payments routed through designated banks. Export of services involves foreign exchange inflow. Customs facilitates FEMA compliance for exports. Example of export scenarios: export of pharmaceuticals to USA, export of IT services to Europe, export of textiles to Africa, agriculture products to Gulf, software to UK, machinery to Australia, educational services abroad, gems and jewelry, food products to Middle East, chemicals to Asia, handicrafts to USA, books for to foreign markets, automobiles to Africa, leather goods in Europe, medical devices to Asia, renewable energy technology consumers, electronics globally, wine to European Union, cosmetics to Africa, export of film content globally. Case laws, Union of India versus Measures MC Kothari, export goods seized due to undervaluation, customs claimed undervaluation of goods. Kothari argued correct market value. High Court ruled in favor. Court upheld export valuation process. Court's customs valuation method followed correctly. Established precedents for valuation cases. Duty assessment must follow rules. Customs must prove undervaluation claim. Court emphasized transparency in valuation. Export documents must match declared values. Court ruled on proper valuation. Export duty assessment must be consistent. Customs must adhere to rules. Exporters' duty to maintain accuracy. Court clarified custom powers. Valuation discrepancies, custom duties, and export documentation confirmed accurate value. Relevant case law number 2, State of Punjab versus Rajiv Textile Mills. Export goods involved in dispute, goods detained due to compliance issues. Rajiv Textile Mills challenged detention. Court ruled detention was invalid. Export documentation provided proof. Customs failed to establish violations. Rajiv Textile claimed compliance with laws. Court emphasized proper documentation. Case clarified export detention powers. Customs must follow procedural correctness. Enforcement powers subject to limits. Legal rights of exporters upheld. Documentation must justify exports properly. Court ruled in favor of exporter. Export duty assessment reviewed prohibited exports, clearly defined validity of customs powers, question customs enforcement powers limited by law, documentation compliance ensured proper clearance, conclusion export laws ensure global trade, goods and services subject to regulation enforce strict export compliance. Exporters must follow documentation, valuation, and duty assessment. Critical exporters' rights safeguarded by law, compliance with foreign exchange laws, necessary case laws, clarify custom powers, trade agreements, encourage international exports, transparency crucial in export transactions, export documentation must match reality, enforcement powers checked by courts, export industry vital to economy, government policies promote export growth, international trade regulations affect exports, export law frameworks are constantly evolving, efficient export processes aid compliance, export documentation and verification, key judicial oversight ensures fair enforcement, exporters drive economic progress globally.